There comes a moment in life when you realize you're walking alone on a road you once shared with beloved people. It's a silent and painful awakening, like waking up in an empty house where familiar voices once lived. You look back and see those who chose to stay where they've always been, comfortable in their certainties while you continue moving forward toward the unknown. This is the heaviest price of personal transformation, discovering that growing often means leaving behind those who refuse to accompany your journey of evolution. Albert Camus knew this existential loneliness well, this weight of carrying a consciousness that expanded beyond the limits others insist on maintaining. The French philosopher lived this experience intensely when he broke with former political and intellectual companions who couldn't understand his refusal to adhere to totalitarian ideologies, even those that promised a better future. Camus chose lucidity over illusion, uncomfortable truth over comforting lies, and he paid the price of this choice with isolation from many he once considered close. This experience led him to understand something fundamental about human nature. Most people prefer the security of the known, even when it's limiting, to the uncertainty of growth. When you decide to question, expand, transform, you're automatically placing yourself in a position that challenges not only your own beliefs, but also the beliefs of those around you. Personal transformation is a revolutionary act, even when it happens silently within you. When you begin questioning patterns you once accepted without thinking, when you start seeing nuances where you once saw only black and white, when you develop the courage to admit you were wrong about important things, you're doing something many people consider deeply threatening. Not because you're directly attacking their choices, but because your simple transformed existence functions as a mirror reflecting possibilities they chose not to explore. Your change becomes a constant reminder that they too could change, but chose not to do so. Camus observed that human beings have a complex relationship with freedom. While they desire it, they also fear it, because freedom means responsibility, and responsibility means abandoning the comfort of blaming external circumstances for our condition. When you decide to take control of your own narrative, when you stop accepting excuses you once offered yourself, when you become responsible for your choices and their consequences, you're demonstrating a form of courage that exposes others' lack of courage. This creates a social discomfort that many people prefer to resolve by distancing you from their lives rather than confronting their own self-imposed limitations. The process of personal growth frequently requires you to question truths you once considered absolute. Perhaps you grew up believing professional success was the ultimate measure of personal worth, and now realize there are other forms of fulfillment. Perhaps you spent years prioritizing external approval and now understand the value of authenticity, even when it displeases. Perhaps you lived trying to control every aspect of life and now accept that uncertainty is part of the human experience. These perspective shifts aren't merely philosophical, they fundamentally alter how you relate to the world and to people. When your priorities change, when your values refine, when your worldview expands, you'll naturally begin making different decisions. You might choose to spend less time in superficial conversations and more time in deep reflections. You might decide that certain social activities you once considered obligatory now seem empty of meaning. You might realize that relationships based only on habits or convenience no longer nourish your soul. These behavioral changes are perceived by those around you, and they're not always well received. Some people will interpret your new choices as implicit judgments about their choices. Resistance to change is a profoundly human phenomenon that Camus explored in his writings about the absurd. He observed that people construct meaning systems to make sense of existence, and when someone close questions these systems, it creates an existential crisis. If you've always believed that working 60 hours a week was synonymous with dedication and success, and someone close decides to prioritize balance and well-being, this forces you to confront the possibility that your belief might be wrong. It's easier to label this person as lazy or unambitious than to examine your own choices. There's also a more subtle aspect to this dynamic. When you change, you force others to confront the immutability of their own positions. If you manage to overcome fears they still carry, develop skills they consider impossible for themselves, or find peace in situations they still experience as conflictual, your transformation becomes living evidence that change is possible. This can be inspiring for some, but for many it's profoundly uncomfortable, because it removes the excuse that certain changes are impossible or that certain limitations are permanent. Camus spoke about the importance of revolt, not as destructive rebellion, but as refusal to accept limitations imposed externally or internally. When you revolt against your own limitations, when you refuse to remain in patterns that no longer serve your growth, you're practicing this form of existential revolt. But not everyone is ready to join this revolt. Many prefer the security of the familiar, even when the familiar is unsatisfactory. They choose known pain over the uncertainty of the unknown, and may see your courage to choose differently as an implicit criticism of this preference. The isolation that accompanies personal growth doesn't only result from external misunderstanding, it also arises from genuine internal changes in how you process experiences and relationships. When you develop greater capacity for introspection, you might discover that superficial conversations become mentally exhausting. When you learn to value authenticity, you might find it difficult to participate in social interactions based on performative personas. When you develop a more nuanced understanding of human complexity, you might lose patience with simplistic judgments or binary thinking. These internal changes naturally affect your ability to connect with people who haven't undergone similar transformations. There are moments when you'll find yourself explaining your perspective to people who lack the experiential context to understand it. It's like trying to describe the colors of sunset to someone who has never seen the sky. You can use all the right words, all the logical arguments, all the careful analogies, but if the other person hasn't had the experiences that led you to that understanding, your words will sound abstract or even incomprehensible. This doesn't make anyone superior or inferior. It simply recognizes that we're at different points in the human journey, and it's not always possible to build bridges between these different positions. The loneliness of growth also arises because personal transformation frequently involves confronting uncomfortable truths about yourself and about the world. When you accept responsibility for destructive patterns you used to attribute to other people, when you recognize that many of your beliefs were adopted without questioning, when you admit you wasted years avoiding necessary changes, you're doing emotional work that many consider unnecessary or even harmful. They might see your self-reflection as excessive self-criticism, your pursuit of growth as pathological dissatisfaction, your willingness to change as instability. It's important to recognize that not all relationships are destined to survive personal transformations, and this isn't necessarily a failure on anyone's part. Some relationships exist in specific contexts and function well within those contexts, but don't have the flexibility or depth to adapt when one or both people change significantly. Relationships based primarily on shared interests might dissolve when those interests change. Relationships based on specific dynamics might become dysfunctional when those dynamics are no longer healthy or desirable for one of the people. Camus wrote extensively about the importance of human solidarity, but also recognized that this solidarity cannot be forced or feigned. True connection requires a level of mutual understanding and respect that isn't always possible when people are in very different places in their personal journeys. You can have compassion for someone who is struggling with issues you've already resolved, but that doesn't mean you can maintain the same type of relationship you had before your transformation. Compassion can coexist with distancing when proximity becomes harmful to the well-being of one or both parties. There's a crucial difference between authentic growth and performative growth, and this difference often determines how others respond to your transformation. Performative growth seeks external validation and frequently involves judging those who aren't on the same path. It's competitive, superior, and often inauthentic. Authentic growth, on the other hand, is internal, humble, and focused on your own journey without need for comparison or external validation. Ironically, it's authentic growth that most frequently results in isolation because it doesn't seek approval and therefore doesn't make concessions to maintain relationships that are no longer mutually beneficial. The emotional price of surpassing beloved people is real and shouldn't be minimized. There's genuine grief in the process of recognizing that certain relationships cannot continue in the form they existed before. There's sadness in realizing that people you love chose to remain in places you can no longer inhabit. There's guilt in moments when you wonder if you should have stayed where you were to maintain relational harmony. There's anger when you feel your growth is misinterpreted or your motives are questioned by people who should know you better. These emotions are a natural part of the transformation process and should be honored, not suppressed. Camus emphasized the importance of living with emotional fullness, of not fleeing from the complexity of human experience. Grief for the loss of relationships, even when this loss results from positive choices, is a legitimate expression of our humanity. You can simultaneously know you made the right choices for your growth and feel sadness about the relational consequences of those choices. Leave a comment sharing. Have you ever lived the experience of feeling alone because you grew beyond what other people were willing to accept? Write simply, "I felt this too," if you identify with this journey. Knowing you're not alone in this experience can bring some comfort, and your honesty can help other people going through the same situation feel less isolated in their own transformations. It's important to understand that the isolation resulting from personal growth is neither permanent nor absolute. While you might distance yourself from some relationships, you also create space for new connections based on who you've become, not on who you used to be. People who are on similar journeys of self-development, who value authenticity over convenience, who are willing to question and grow, will naturally gravitate toward you. These new relationships often have a depth and quality that might not have existed in previous connections, based primarily on physical proximity or shared history. The process also teaches valuable discernment about the types of relationships that truly nourish your soul versus those that exist out of habit, social obligation, or fear of loneliness. You learn to differentiate between superficial connections that drain your energy and deep relationships that energize and inspire. You develop the capacity to be alone without feeling lonely, to find contentment in your own company, to use solitude time for reflection, creativity, and continued growth. Camus believed that authentic life requires courage to face reality without comforting illusions. Applied to relationships, this means recognizing when connections are based more on nostalgia than present reality, when we maintain relationships out of fear of change instead of genuine joy in the other's company, when we pretend compatibility that no longer exists to avoid difficult conversations. The courage to face these relational realities is an integral part of the personal growth journey. There's also a liberating aspect to this process of relational differentiation. When you stop trying to be all things to all people, when you accept that you can't keep everyone happy with your choices, when you prioritize authenticity over popularity, you experience a form of freedom that is simultaneously frightening and exhilarating. You discover internal resources you might not have known you possessed when you depended excessively on external validation. You develop confidence in your own judgment, in your own perceptions, in your capacity to navigate life even when others disagree with your choices. This freedom also brings increased responsibility. When you can no longer blame others for your unhappiness, when you recognize your power of choice in almost all situations, when you accept that you are the protagonist of your own story, you must also accept responsibility for the consequences of your choices. This includes responsibility for the isolation that might result from your growth decisions. You cannot simultaneously have the freedom to change and the guarantee that everyone will approve of or accompany your changes. The Camusian concept of revolt applies not only to political or social systems, but also to relational expectations that limit your growth. When you revolt against the expectation that you should remain static to keep others comfortable, when you refuse to dim your light so others don't feel outshone, when you insist on your dignity, even when it means standing alone, you're practicing the purest form of existential revolt. It's not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but affirmation of your full humanity against forces that try to limit it. There's wisdom in recognizing that not all resistance to your growth is malicious or conscious. Many people who resist others' changes do so out of fear, insecurity, or genuine concern. They might fear you'll abandon them, that you'll judge their choices to stay where they are negatively, that your transformation means the relationship no longer has value for you. Understanding these motivations can help you respond with compassion instead of defensiveness, even when you cannot alter the fundamental outcome of the situation. Compassion, however, doesn't require self-sacrifice. You can have empathy for others' insecurities without sacrificing your own growth to alleviate them. You can recognize others' fear without allowing that fear to dictate your choices. You can love people who cannot accompany your journey without feeling obligated to abandon that journey to remain with them. Emotional maturity involves finding this balance between compassion for others and responsibility for yourself. If you feel you need to be part of a community of people who also value growth, authenticity, and courage to face life without comforting illusions, consider subscribing to this channel. Here we explore these deep existential questions with the honesty they deserve, without trying to offer easy answers to complex questions. Your individual journey deserves to be honored, and sometimes honoring it means finding spaces where it can be understood and supported. The existential loneliness that accompanies growth also offers unique opportunities for spiritual and philosophical development. When you can no longer depend on external consensus to validate your perceptions, you're forced to develop a more refined internal moral compass. When you cannot use others' approval as a measure of success, you must discover more authentic metrics of progress and fulfillment. When you cannot avoid difficult questions by hiding in constant social activities, you must develop the capacity to sit with discomfort and extract wisdom from it. Camus saw in solitude not a state to be avoided, but a condition to be inhabited with dignity. He recognized that moments of isolation can be profoundly generative, allowing reflection, creativity, and self-knowledge that aren't possible in constant company of others. Chosen solitude, resulting from authentic decisions, has a different quality from solitude imposed by external circumstances. It carries within itself the seed of freedom, even when it also carries the weight of responsibility. Significant personal growth rarely happens without some level of disintegration of what came before. Old identities need to die so new ones can be born. Former relationship patterns need to dissolve so new forms of connection can emerge. Belief systems that no longer serve need to be questioned, even when they provided psychological security. This process of disintegration and reconstruction is naturally disorienting and can be misunderstood by external observers who see only apparent destruction, not the reconstruction happening simultaneously. It's crucial to recognize that surpassing people doesn't necessarily mean leaving them behind permanently. Sometimes your growth might eventually inspire similar growth in others, creating possibility for reconnection at a deeper level than existed before. Other times, people might be at different points of readiness for change, and what seems like permanent incompatibility might just be a matter of timing. Wisdom lies in remaining open to these possibilities without depending on them or sacrificing your own progress waiting for them. The journey of personal growth is fundamentally solitary, not because you're destined to remain alone forever, but because no one else can do the internal work for you. No one else can face your fears, question your beliefs, or choose your transformations. Other people can offer support, perspective, or company, but the courage to change must come from within. Accepting this fundamental solitude is part of accepting total responsibility for your own life and well-being. Albert Camus taught us that authentic life is not an easy life, but it is a life worth living. The price of surpassing people who never wanted to change is high, but the alternative cost of remaining stagnant to maintain relationships based on the previous version of yourself might be even higher. The choice isn't between happiness and growth, but between the superficial satisfaction of avoiding discomfort and the deep fulfillment of living aligned with your highest values. In the end, you'll discover that the loneliness resulting from authentic choices has a dignity that company based on inauthentic compromises can never offer. You'll learn to inhabit your own life with courage, knowing that growing beyond others isn't a betrayal, but an act of fidelity to your own constantly evolving humanity.